Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and we're on the last part the 6th of Jude the Obscure, and I think probably 3 more, well, this video and maybe 2 more, and then I'll be done, and I won't ever do this again. But this video is actually the most tragic. We're at the most tragic part. These first couple of chapters. This is where things really fall apart. And I think this has to be probably the most tragic scene I've ever read. King Lear is definitely tragic at the end. There was a question of King Lear. Is King Lear too sad? And it makes you wonder, well, why tragedies in the first place? Well, from a literary point of view, tragedies reach kind of the highest level of what's aesthetic. And this one doesn't particularly do it, but in Shakespeare's King Lear, it's so sad that it actually reaches the sublime. And if I ever do a video maybe on it, you'll see what I mean. But that's the highest point, of where you can take your consciousness in all of this. What it does, it stays with you. And this is the kind of book, if you've been reading, that you're not going to forget. I mean, you're not going to forget this scene ever. So part the 6 goes back to Christminster. It's Christminster again. And he wants to go back during a celebration anniversary of Remembrance Day. And this was an actual thing that Hardy went to at Oxford. And it's sort of like a parade. If I'm getting this correct, it should be, I guess Remembrance Day would be like remembering the saints and the martyrs. And I'm sure martyrdom has something to do with this Remembrance Day, just because of what's going to happen. But at any rate, okay, so let me get into the text. They're there. Jude is very excited about this. But Sue is pregnant, and she already has 2 small children of her own. And then there's little Father Time, who they also call Jude. They're not as enthused to be there as Jude is. For one thing, they don't know where they're going to stay. And lodgings becomes a problem with more children during this time. So, Sue is especially a little apprehensive about this. And Jude starts to kind of go back to his old dream, where he's not really in reality. He's somewhere else. And so he's excited about this. Sue keeps suggesting, shouldn't we find some place to stay first? I mean, let's make sure we have a roof over our heads before it's too late, And at first Jude agrees, but then he starts to kind of see the processions going to begin, and he's like, well, let's not, why worry about that? This is going to happen. So we'll do this, and then, then we'll worry about where we're going to stay. Also, it's about to rain. So they're standing out there, and the clouds are moving in, and it's getting dark, sort of like the objective correlative, nature is reflecting what's going to happen. always happens, like in Shakespeare's plays. The storm is brewing because something bad is about to happen. And Father Time notices the clouds, and he sees these figures, of these men in what Hardy calls like blood red robes. And so they're making their way in, and the sky has grown overcast, and the thunder is now starting to rumble, and Father Time shudders and says, "It do seem like Judgment Day," which is interesting because it's Remembrance Day. But, it kind of has the same effect that, yes, we're commemorating people who died, but they did die, and if they were martyred, probably in a terrible way. And what Father Time sees this as Judgment Day. So Jude, of course, isn't really paying any attention to, the way his family is resisting this whole scene. And somebody asked a question. I think it was like a Latin term or something that happens, and Jude explains this and that, and he can kind of go on about the colleges and things like that, and pretty soon people are gonna look at him and say, what is this? This is a working man. He seems to be extremely knowledgeable. And then one of them remembers, I know those guy. I used to work with them, And one of the guys says, I know that man. He used to work here years ago. Jude Foley, that's his name. Don't you mind? He used to be nicknamed Tutor of St. Slums. Do you mind? Do you mind is just sort of their slang. Because he aimed at that line of business. He's married, I suppose, and that's his child. And the speaker's name was Jack Stagg, who's worked with him. And then there was Tinker Taylor was there, and says, you've honored us by coming back. But, they're going to tease him a little bit and said, so you didn't do any great things for yourself, And Jude says, no, except you got more kids, now you have more mouths to feed. And, he agrees, and he's, in a pretty good humor. He's kind of used to this, being picked on. And Taylor reminds him of the Apostles' Creed. Do you remember when you did that at the bar? That was fun. And Sue is not liking this at all. And she's saying, don't answer anymore, Jude. Because she knows what they're trying to do. And this kind of brings Jude into a mode of where he decides, to give a speech. And so, they ask him a question about, let me see. But fortune didn't lie that way. Your powers were not enough to get to carry you through. Okay? And this is how Jude responds. It is a difficult question, my friends, for any young man. That question I had to grapple with, and which thousands are weighing at the present moment in these uprising times. Whether to follow uncritically the track he finds himself in without considering his aptness for it, or to consider what his aptness or bent may be, and reshape his course accordingly. And so what he's basically saying is, here's the difficult question. Should you follow your dreams and risk looking like a fool? Even when like fate is against you, odds are against you, do you pursue it anyways? And he says that, he tried the latter and failed. But I don't admit that my failure proved my view to be a wrong one, or that my success would have made it a right one. Though that's how we appraise. So, based on whether or not you're successful, it's going to be how people are going to judge you. Either you're a fool or you're a genius. But it's still doing the same act, which is taking action, which is taking a risk. And so he says, I mean not by their essential soundness, but by their accidental outcomes. Like, who knows if this is going to work? It's not really even up to us. If I had ended by becoming like one of these gentlemen in red and black that we see dropping in here by now, everybody would have said, see how wise that young man was to follow the bent of his nature. But having ended no better than I began, they say, see what a fool that fellow was in following a freak of his fancy. And this part also kind of reminds me of, remember when he wrote the words, quoting Job on the college, that I have just as much understanding as you, but you don't know exactly what I know. And Jude says, yeah, I was defeated, but I was defeated by poverty, not by a lack of will. It's not like they gave him a chance and then found out he wasn't good enough. They just didn't let him in. They didn't let him try. So he says, you can go ahead and ridicule me, but, if you had been in my shoes, if you'd known what I've been through, you would pity me. In a frightful example of what not to do. And so illustrate a moral story, continued Jude, beginning to grow bitter, though he had opened serenely enough. I was, perhaps, after all, a paltry victim to the spirit of mental and social restlessness that makes so many unhappy these days. So I'm a victim of my own mind and spirit and ambition. I was driven to do these things. I couldn't even, help it. And Sue's getting more and more upset. She's kind of embarrassed for him because, just like with Job, the quote, the righteous man is laughed to scorn. So she sees that. She sees that you're just giving them, the bait. And so just don't tell them anymore. And she says, you weren't that. You struggled nobly to acquire knowledge. And only the meanest souls in the world would blame you. So this kind of goes on. But Jude says something else before he leaves. He's got a little bit more words of wisdom for them, and he makes a very good point here. He says, "In what I appear, a sick and poor man, is not the worst of me. I am in a chaos of principles, groping in the dark." And he's talking about now his dark night of the soul, which is worse, acting by instinct and not after example. 8 or 9 years ago, when I came here first, I had a neat stock of fixed opinions, but they dropped away one by one. It's talking about losing his faith. And the further I get, the less sure I am. I doubt if I have anything more for my present rule of life than following inclinations, which do me and nobody else any harm, and actually give pleasure to those I love best. There, gentlemen, since you wanted to know how I was getting on, I have told you. Much good it may do you. I cannot explain further here. I perceive there is something wrong somewhere in our social formulas. What it is can only be discovered by men or women with greater insight than mine, if indeed they ever discover it, at least in our time. For who knoweth what is good for man in this life, and who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? And so now he's quoting Ecclesiastes. If you know anything about Ecclesiastes, it's kind of famous for the song. There's a time, a season, a time to die, a time to live, a time to build, all that kind of stuff. The beginning of Ecclesiastes, he's talking about how hard he's worked, and he's wondering, who's going to take care of my land that I've, been laboring and working on all my life. What is it? Is it going to be meaningless? And the crowd at this point is like, preach it. Like, this guy, he's better than the priest that we have. And, so they can see that Jude, has the skill and the ability, and that he would have made, a very good priest. But, and then something happens where one of the guys who's, a doctorate of something, his horse acts up and lays down or something, and the man gets up and he starts kicking the animal in the stomach. And Jude's like, see, right there. Is this really as far as our education has gone, where people still behave like this? Because, what's the purpose of education if not to, help people become more empathetic and thoughtful, or civilized? And that's, that's why it's a requirement. So anyways, they go through this, and he's still trying to get a good look at these guys, even though it probably tortures him. He just wants to see it. And, he can't exactly go where they are going. And he says, I wish I could get in. He said, maybe I could catch a few words of Latin. And at any rate, he still, can't. He's shut out. There's that wall again. And he says, well, I'm an outsider to the end of my days. He says, well, now we can go. Okay, let's go. And so they start looking for somewhere to stay. And of course, they're rejected because they have children. And, Father Time this whole time is looking at this place like, I hate it here. And he said, I don't like Christminster. And then he asks, are these, well, he's looking at colleges. He says, are these jails? And Jude, oblivious, no, colleges, and perhaps you'll study there someday. And Father Time says, I'd rather not. And Sue makes a comment that leaving Kittenbridge for a place like this is like coming from Caiaphas to Pilate. So if you know anything, Pilate that's who Jesus was handed to. So they can't really find a place to stay all together. There's one lady who will take Sue and the kids but won't take Jude. Somehow they seem to know that they're not married. I don't know how they're figuring this out, but Sue makes a mistake because the woman does ask are you really married? And, for some reason Sue just goes ahead and tries to explain, which is also news to us because we don't, we don't really know from the last section because they are going on as if they're married. Sue's taking his last name. But anyways, she does not understand at all. Therefore, through her own sense of words, she was married. She was a married woman in Sue's mind, but in the landlady's mind, she's not. And so she ends up telling her husband, and her husband says, "Well, I'm not going to have a woman like that staying under my roof. Get rid of her." And so she breaks the news to Sue. "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave. My husband doesn't approve." And Father Time is watching this, and he's realizing that it's the kids that we're the reason. That they're having all this trouble. And he says, "I ought not to have been born. Ought I?" asked the boy. And Sue at this point is just very tired. And she can't really give a good answer. So this leads into the next chapter of what's going to happen. So the next chapter, she has a conversation with Father Time, because Father Time knows that they're not going to be able to stay. So, where are we going to go? What are we going to do? And she says she's worried about Jude. He's not going to take this too well. And he writes that the boy, the brooding, under-demonstrative horror seemed to have seized him. The silence was broken with him saying, "Mother, what shall we do tomorrow?" "I don't know," said Sue despondently. "I'm afraid this will trouble your father. And I wish Father was quite well and that there was room for him. Then it wouldn't matter so much. Poor Father. It wouldn't." And he asked, "Can I do anything?" "No, all is trouble, adversity, and suffering. Father went away to give us children room, didn't he? Partly. And it would be better to be out of the world than in it, wouldn't it? It would almost, dear. 'Tis because of us children, too, isn't it, that you can't get a good lodging?" "Well, people do object to children sometimes." "Then if children make so much trouble, why do people have them?" "Oh, because it is a law of nature." "But we don't ask to be born." "No, indeed." And that law of nature is like going back to naturalism. Except now it's like, just even with having children. So, and of course children were seen as a burden during this time, which of course wasn't their fault, but you see how people treated them. And unfortunately, Father Time is able to comprehend a lot more than he should at this point. This should just be an anxiety for Sue and Jude, Senior, not for a little boy. It's just not healthy. Then Father Time says something that's like foreboding. He says, "I think that whenever children be born that aren't wanted, they should be killed directly, before their souls come to him, and not allowed to grow big and walk about." Sue did not reply. She was doubtfully pondering how to treat this too reflective child. At last she concluded that, as far as circumstances permitted, she would be honest and candid with him, which is not a very good idea at this point. But she tells him that, guess what? I'm pregnant. And he says, how? And she said, there's going to be another baby. What? Oh God, Mother, you never sent for another. Such trouble with what you've got. Yes, I have. I'm sorry to say. And he gets very angry with her. Of course, he doesn't understand how this all comes about. But, how could you do this to us? How could you be so cruel and wicked as to bring another child into this world when we can't even take care of ourselves? So as you can see, this is a little bit of Hardy really digging in to kind of stir up some people's emotions here about the idea of whether or not, if we're not going to take care of children, whether we should bring them in the world or not. But it's sad because it's coming from a child's point of view at this point. So he's angry with her, and she asks, you have to forgive me. I can't explain this to you. I'll explain it to you when you're older. But, it's really not my fault. And it probably isn't really her fault. But it happens. So, at any rate, the kids are staying like in a little closet area. And the next morning, she goes to find Jude, and they have breakfast together. And then they decide to go back to the place where she's staying, where the children are. When she comes back in, she goes into their bedroom, and she basically screams. And it says that Jude, he looked in bewilderment around the room. At the back of the door were fixed 2 hooks for hanging garments, and from these the forms of the two youngest children were suspended by a piece of box cord round each of their necks, while from a nail a few yards off the body of little Jude was hanging in a similar manner. An overturned chair was near the elder boy, and his glazed eyes were slanted into the room, but those of the girl and the baby boy were closed. Half paralyzed by the strange and consummate horror of the scene, he let Sue lie, cut the cords with his pocket knife, and threw the 3 children on the bed. But the feel of their bodies in the momentary handling seemed to say that they were dead. He caught up Sue, who was in fainting fits, and put her on the bed in the other room, after which he breathlessly summoned the landlady and ran out for a doctor. So, as I said, this is about as horrible as it gets. So, the oldest, Jude, decided that he would hang his brother and sister and himself. I'll just tell you this little story. Once I was teaching this, and I was fully prepared to shock the students because I assumed they didn't read, because most of the time they wouldn't read ahead of time. And I walked in the classroom, and I was, still, kind of my head in the book. And I glanced over at the board, and somebody in the class had drawn the scene with stick figures. And I screamed, and they just laughed and laughed. So when people say to me, that teenagers are too sensitive for this sort of thing, it's like, have you met them? Because, there's never a dull moment. It was always crazy in my room. But anyways, let me read this part to you. the children were past saving, for though their bodies were still barely cold, it was conjectured that they had been hanging more than an hour. The probability held by the parents later on, when they were able to reason on the case, was that the elder boy, on waking, looked into the outer room for Sue, and finding her absent, was thrown into a fit of aggravated despondency. That the events and information of the evening before had induced in his morbid temperament. Moreover, a piece of paper was found upon the floor, on which was written in the boy's hand with the bit of lead pencil that he carried, "Done because we are too many." My students also were clever enough to put the sign above the morbid drawing that it was done because we were too many. So what do you say after that? It's pretty tragic. This is very tragic. But it's even kind of gets worse as you see what this does to Sue and what this will do to their relationship. So, a doctor does come, but of course they're beyond hope. And Sue, of course, is not wanting to believe this. She keeps inquiring, about her children. I mean, she's in shock. When you get news like this or you see something like this, it's so horrible. It feels like a dream. This cannot be happening. This cannot be true. And she also starts to kind of confess to Jude that I may be to blame for this because I had this conversation with Father Time. And, and he was asking me about, whether or not it's best to be born. And, and she was in a very pessimistic mood, and she was very candid with him. And so now she's questioning, and she's saying it's her fault. And Jude says, it was in his nature to do it. The doctor says there are such boys springing up among us, boys of a sort unknown in the last generation. The outcome of new views of life. They seem to see all its terrors before they are old enough to have staying power to resist them. He says it is the beginning of the coming universal wish not to live. He's an advanced man, the doctor, but it can give no consolation to. Jude had kept back his own grief on account of her, but now he broke down, and this stimulated Sue's efforts of sympathy, which in some degree distracted her from her poignant self-reproach. When everybody was gone, she was allowed to see the children. So after that, there's this music going on in the background, and Jude realizes it's the organ, and it's somebody's practicing the piano, and they're playing the 73rd Psalm. Truly God is loving unto Israel. Sue is sobbing, "Oh, my babies, they done no harm. Why should they be taken away? Why them, not me?" Just asking that kind of question. And then they hear a couple of people talking, and Sue's feeling very paranoid and says, "They're talking about us, no doubt. We are made spectacle unto the world, and unto angels, and to men," which is quoting Apostle Paul in Corinthians. Jude listened. "No, they're not talking of us," he said. "They're two clergymen of different views arguing about the eastward position." Good God, the eastward position, and all creation groaning. So the eastward is like facing east. So I know in the Orthodox Church you do try to get the altar and everything, the icons where you're facing east. So there's some debate about that going on, and it's just like, in the greater scheme of things, what does this matter? What do all these little, theological arguments matter when, a child has just died? And so Hardy just throws that in there. And then Sue says something that is something that you should hang on to if you are an AP student and you're thinking about writing about Jude the Obscure. There was another stillness, broken at last by two persons in conversation, somewhat without. Oh, I just read that part. Then another silence, till she was seized with another uncontrollable fit of grief. There is something external to us which says, you shan't. First it said, you shan't learn. Then it said, you shan't labor. Now it says, you shan't love. He tried to soothe her by saying, that's bitter of you, darling, but it's true. And this is so important, this line right here, and it's not going to be that hard to memorize. You want to have some things, if you are doing this for AP course, they're important lines that really point to the whole meaning of the work. And this is one of them, because as I said earlier, yes, it's about a boy who didn't get to go to Oxford. But look what happens, what tragedy escalates because of this thing, of someone not being able to do what he was supposed to do, what he was meant to do. And then he can't work. So he can't learn, and then he can't work, and he can't provide, and then guess what? Now you can't love. Now everything is gone. And it's something also like tragedy, something in the universe. It's not just about people who are flawed and make a lot of bad choices. In tragedy, there's something else going on. The wheel of fortune is supposed to be turning here, but it doesn't turn back up. In a tragedy, it just keeps getting worse, and that's how the book, ends. It will just keep getting worse from here on out. But you've made it this far, so may as well stick with it. And this next line is really also important because it starts to show a shift in Sue. She is blaming herself. And in many ways, Sue starts to believe that she should be punished. That she should be punished by God. And so she says to Jude, my eyes are so swollen I can scarcely see. And yet, little more than a year ago, I called myself happy. We went on about loving each other too much. Indulging ourselves to utter selfishness with each other. We said, do you remember that we would make a virtue of joy? I said it was nature's intention, nature's law. And raison d'etre, whatever that says, nature's reason, that we should be joyful in what instincts she affords us. Instincts which civilization had taken upon itself to thwart. What dreadful things I said. And now fate has given us this stab in the back for being such fools as to take nature at her word. We trusted that our love, would be enough, that we could do things our own way, and that we should do things our own way, and that we should be independent. And look at what we got, we got this because, you know, in a way we asked for it. By being too loving, you know, by loving each other too freely, by not living by the letter. It's you see that there's this kind of, you know, self-made hell. You know, it's very punishing. You know, this is a very punishing idea of God and nature, that she's going to get you in the end. You can't allow yourself to be too free or too happy, or you're going to have to pay for it, you know, like everybody else. So then at the end of the chapter, you have another, you know, horrible scene where they're about to bury the children, and Sue is wanting the grave digger to dig it back up again. Let me see him one more time. Let me see my babies. And, you know, she's hysterical and she's pleading just as any mother would. Of course, this is happening very fast. And that's all she really wants. It's just let me see him again. And so this, of course, causes a problem. And the guy says, you know, he sees that she's pregnant. And he says, you need to take care of yourself right now. You know, and then, you know, thank God you've got another one that's going to assuage the grief. But instead, she ends up giving birth to a stillborn child. And Hardy says, at the last hour, the intelligence was brought to Jude that a child had been prematurely born, and that it, like the others, was a corpse. So it's very, very sad, very tragic. But it's, you know, it's supposed to be. And so I guess the thing that you have to think about is, you know, why Hardy would go to this extreme to make his point. To make his point about poverty, about education. As hard as it is to read, you know, there's truth in it. There's truth in what happens to people, especially during his time. So, at any rate, please join me next time, and we'll keep going with this. And I'll probably do 2 more videos and be done. All right, thanks for sticking with me.